Is your employer allowed to end your remote working arrangement? Hi, I'm Mike from Cash and Legal, and in this video, I'm going to discuss an employer's ability to end a remote working arrangement. At the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of when an employer can and cannot end a remote working arrangement and what some of the consequences might be if the employer improperly ends a remote working arrangement. During the pandemic, remote working arrangements became the norm for many office-based employees. Social distancing rules required employers to adapt to a new set of circumstances and facilitate work while everyone was unable to interact with each other in person. Understandably, many employees preferred remote working arrangements because they were more flexible and aligned with people's personal schedules. However, gradually over the last few years, we have seen employers shifting back to in-person working requirements. Every day, we hear about another large company somewhere in North America that is requiring employees to reattend in the workplace. If you work in Alberta and you've recently been asked to come back to the workplace after years of working remote, particularly during COVID, you may be wondering whether your employer is permitted to do this. This question fundamentally turns on the terms of the agreement between you and your employer. This means the question on whether an employer can ask you to come back to the office turns on the terms of your employment contract. If your employment contract specifically stipulates that you are a remote employee, then your employer generally cannot ask you to come back to the office. However, if your employment contract specifically stipulates that your employer has the ability to decide where you do your work, then your employer likely does have the ability to request that you return to work. If your employment contract is silent on this issue, then it depends on the history of the working arrangement between you and your employer. If you worked remotely before COVID for an extended period of time and there were no issues with you performing your role remotely, then you have a stronger case to say that your employer can't request that you return to work. However, for the employees who were sent home during COVID and are now being asked to return to work, those employees have a weaker argument in that regard. The courts have generally recognized that COVID-based arrangements were designed to facilitate an exceptional set of circumstances and do not reflect the true intention of the agreements between the parties. As such, the courts have generally upheld employers' efforts to walk back COVID-era remote working policies. There may be some employees who are required to work remotely because of health considerations or familial considerations. These employees would receive protections under human rights statutes and may not be required to go back to the office. If an employer is requesting that an employee go back to the office, but the employee raises a genuine human rights concern, the employer must respond appropriately to that concern. This means the employer must accommodate the employee up to the point of undue hardship. If the employer can prove that it would be an undue hardship to facilitate remote work for that particular employee, then the employer can request that the employee comes back to work. On the flip side, if the employee can establish that their medical condition and a familiar circumstance or other protected ground requires that they work remotely, then the employer cannot request that the employee return to work. If an employee has a clause in their employment contract that permits them to work remotely, but the employer insists that they return to work, this would be a breach of the employment agreement. This breach might result in a claim for constructive dismissal, where the employee resigns and pursues a claim against their employer for severance. If your employer is requesting that you return to work, here is some advice that you can follow in order to protect yourself in the situation. Step number 1 is to review your employment agreement. Determine whether your contract contemplates a request by your employer dictating where you work. If your agreement specifically guarantees the right to remote work, that puts you in a relatively strong position. Secondly, ask to confirm the change in writing. Get a written record from your employer for the request, including an explanation for why the request is necessary. At that point in time, you can assess whether the change is reasonable. And if you're having some trouble making that assessment on your own, you can contact an employment lawyer. As a next step, once you've had the opportunity to review the situation, you can re-engage and see whether you can convince your employer to continue with the remote working arrangement. Finally, if you're unable to resolve the situation with your employer, we encourage you to get legal advice in order to understand the situation and provide a strategy for next steps. The bottom line is that in some circumstances, employer can insist on a return to work, and in other situations they can't. If your employer has recently requested that you return to work and you don't know what to do, please do not hesitate to contact our office today and book a consultation.